Good morning, everybody. Super excited for today's conversation on plain language. My name is Habib, and I am the co-founder of Qordoba. We're a product that enables teams to write as one. And this morning, super happy to be joined by Deborah Bosley from the Plain Language Group. Deborah has spent the past 20 years helping organizations write content that is easy for people to understand and use. Deborah is the author of 3 books, co-author of 3 books, and the author of more than 24 articles on issues related to clear communication. Deborah, thanks so much for joining us today. We're so excited to listen and learn with you this morning.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank May and my audience, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk about plain language and its effect on customers. And one of the things I like to think is that people like ourselves in the audience and I act as advocates for our customers.
Absolutely.
So, thank you. So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, totally. Just a little bit of housekeeping for our folks on the phone. The webinar is an hour. You're going to be muted for most of the time, but there'll be time for QA at the end. This is such an exciting audience and an exciting topic. We're going to make sure we've got at least 15 minutes of Q&A at the very end. To ask questions, as it says here, use the Q&A box in the webinar Chrome. It's going to be near the bottom of that window, and we're going to try to answer as many as possible. So your questions may be grouped with others by topic. And if you're going to tweet during the webinar, please mention Deborah and ourselves. That'll help us keep the conversation organized. And we will also send out a recording of this webinar, including the Q&A later this week. And with that, I will turn it over to Deborah.
Thank you again. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the audience and to speak on plain language, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to be moving through these slides, and certainly at any point that you have a question, please make sure that you use the Q&A box. So how to use plain language for better customer experience. This is the content of today's presentation. I'm going to give you a definition of what is plain language, and this definition has been created through both national and international organizations. So there is a common sense of what we mean by plain language. How do we know it works? I'm going to give you some information from research studies that support the variety of ways in which it works, not only for our customers, but also for our corporations or government agencies. I'll then show you what plain language strategies are so that you have a good understanding of that specifically. And then how can it improve customer experience? I will give you a case study of a project I worked on for TIAA, who graciously allows me to use their name. So I have to thank them too. So let's get started. So here are the problems. Every sector thinks its issues are unique when it comes to clear communication. So whether you're in technology, finance, health, government agency, it really doesn't matter because the issues over my 20 years of experience have been the same. So lacking clarity, that means that people literally can't understand the information you're presenting to them, and they often are not sure what action they're supposed to take. We also have a tendency to include too much information. That is, you're pushing information to your customers, but that might not be what your customer needs. So I always say, tell people what they need to know rather than what you want to tell them, because those two things are not always aligned. Third, we tend to also assume that our customers have knowledge, experience, or understanding that in fact they may not. Just as a quick example, recently I did some work with a technology firm in Silicon Valley, and they were trying to take their technical information and make it read more easily. However, they assume that all the technical people or the IT people who would be reading their information knew their own internal way of talking about products and processes, when in fact it became clear that because you're in the same field doesn't necessarily mean you have the same knowledge or experience. And the truth of that also is that most of us want to get through information as quickly as we can, understanding as much as we can without exerting too much effort. I mean, that is the experience our customers want. Next, we tend to provide text that is too dense, although much information, of course, is not read in print anymore, but written online. But we see problems of lines stretching clear across the screen, paragraphs that are too large, and information like numbers buried within paragraphs. Now, I'll be showing examples of that. Using jargon, as I mentioned, we have internal jargon that we have to be aware that external people don't understand. We use jargon within a department that other employees may not understand. We use jargon that we think is sector specific, but in fact, the way one financial institution talks about a product may not be using the same language in quotes, the same words as another financial company, even talking about a similar product. And then also we tend to forget how important formatting is. And I would say that is particularly true, not only in print, but online as well, where we use typeface that's too light or too small or too difficult for people to read. So all the sectors tend to have these problems. So just as a quick example, if I were standing in front of you, we could all laugh about this together. I'm driving back from the mountains in North Carolina, and I come to a stop sign, a stop light, and this is what I see on the corner. And so, you know, you talk about too much information, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, the context in which someone is going to be reading the content that you have created. And yet in this situation, I had about 5 seconds because the light turned green to make a decision about which way I was supposed to go on the route I wanted to be on. So whoever created this did not think at all about the context in which someone was going to be reading this. So that's another sort of common problem, I think, that we find in all sectors. So how do we define plain language? We define it as the following. So I'll let you read this to yourself. So notice there are the 3 words in the definition: to find, because of course no one reads anymore. We're skimming, we're scanning, we're looking. We're like explorers going out west trying to find whatever it is we may be looking for. And we're not necessarily looking at the landscape. We're looking at the goal that we have in mind for the information we want to find. Once we find it, we want to be able to understand it quickly. And once we understand it, then of course, we want to be able to use it. So whether it's information on a website, and frankly, most of us have gotten to right before that point where maybe we were going to buy something, but they just made us go through one too many moves or actions, and we just drop off. So how are we going to easily use that content? And then within the field, these 3 elements are sort of our mantra. It must be clear, it should be concise, and it must be credible. So just to give you a few kind of little brief things about strategies for plain language, I have these, it says 6 and that there are only 5. So excuse me for that error. So be accurate, I would say. Make sure that you're accurate. But anyway, be brief. And so normally what we would say is that 30% of all content could be eliminated without changing the meaning and without leaving out information. So kind of a 30% goal of reducing content. Sentences, a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that short sentences are really necessary, particularly in today's world where we have such a short attention span and we have such a short load on short-term memory. Many of us as customers and as content creators find that by the time we get to the end of a sentence, we may have forgotten where the sentence began. So 15 to 18 words would be the best area, the best sort of barometer for the size of your sentence. Paragraphs also should be short, particularly in print and online, no more than 3 to 5 short sentences per paragraph, because then the eye can capture all of the text within that paragraph. We want to include headings, at least 3 to 5 per page or per screen. So again, if we go back to the definition of people trying to find information, those headings become the signposts along the way to tell us what information is contained in the level or the area that we're looking at. Columns are very important. Columns, I will show you an example in a minute. Even in print content, columns can be much easier for people to read. We want to try to write at about an 8th grade level, and there are all kinds of ways that we can determine that, but the average adult in the United States reads at an 8th grade level, and unless you're in a very specialized field with a very specialized product that only specialized people are purchasing, my guess would be most of your customers would just be the average adult. So keeping things simple. And again, even for someone like me with a PhD, frankly, I'm happy to read something that's quick and easy. There's no need for complications, just to show kind of a false intellectualism. And then finally, design. Design is really critical to the materials that we are presenting to our readers or our customers. So let's move on. So I know you can't read this, which in a sense is the point, but I want to show you how design matters to make customers feel that at least they can find their way through a document. So on the left, we have a document written almost as if you would have written an academic report, dense paragraphs, justified right margins, which we don't recommend at all anymore because it spreads type out too far. A few headings, so a couple headings, so that's good. But let's show you how it could be redesigned. So, excuse me. So in this case, it's basically the same information, but notice that we've used boxes, we've used tables, we've used lists, we've used headings, we've used capitalization and then the lack of capitalization depending upon whether it's a heading or a subheading. And if you'll notice on the right, I think we would find that people will approach that. Now, of course, we can never guarantee how much anyone is going to read, but there's a much better chance someone will read what's on the right than what's on the left. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to the way we're formatting information before we get into the actual writing strategies is that 38% of the users are not going to stay on a site if it's unattractive, if it looks difficult to read, if there's too much information, etc. So this is why we talk about design and formatting as being so critical to the understandability and the likelihood somebody would actually read what it is you had created for them. So let's also take a look now at, this is an agreement, so I'm going to start showing you some before and afters as we go through this so that you can actually see what I'm talking about. I'm sure, again, since many of you are in marketing, the concept of plain language is probably familiar to you, but in other areas, I think people need a lot more help than they're getting. So this is just a standard agreement that has to do with purchasing a cell phone. It's an agreement that, granted, none of us ever spend time reading. And part of the reason we don't is because of how it looks and the language that is used within it. So in this particular case, this would measure at about a 16th grade level, just if I were to try to read the agreement on my cell phone. Now, of course, I probably wouldn't because of how it looks and time and all the other elements that are pulling at us. But let's take a look at a rewrite. And the rewrite was vetted by an attorney, and so I know that it contains the same meaning. But what is the likelihood that you would read this instead? So if you'll notice, we've condensed this in half. The other example was 141 words. We're now down to 70. The other measured at a 16th grade level. This one measures at 8. And notice the use of bullets. So we really, I'm just going to go back for just a second. I'm sorry. Oh, excuse me. I'm having just a little technical problem here. Well, there we go. Here we go. I'm sorry. I apologize. All right, so that's what we had started with. And again, we moved to this instead. So there's a much higher likelihood that someone would actually read this information. So now we'll move forward more smoothly. So I like jokes about jargon, and incidentally, Forbes magazine has published a recent article about the uncontrollable use of jargon in the business world in all sectors. So I thought this joke was rather appropriate. So let's get to some of the heart of what are the benefits or what are the problems that we cause, not only for our customers, because obviously even from that simple before and after I showed you, the first example was not going to give the customer any sense of, not even delight, my gosh, not even any sense of feeling like he or she would have anything but frustration were they to try to read it. So as we go through this presentation, I'll show you more examples like that. But right now I want to focus on what gets lost when we give customers information that is difficult for them to understand because of the way we have written it. The problem is not that people don't read. The problem is that we have trained our customers not to read a lot of the information that they need to be reading. So there was a study done recently in which they looked at Fortune 500 companies and calculated that $396 billion was wasted every year because of poor communication, which then became reduced to $62.4 million per company that they surveyed, which means approximately $26,000 per worker per year wasted on poor communication internally and certainly externally as well. And then $75,000 per manager was wasted because when you create written content, the likelihood is that someone else has to sign off on it. And often before they sign off on it, they have to give you feedback on it or make changes or somehow control the content that is being sent to customers. And that particular person, whomever that might be within a company, is wasting approximately $75,000 a year spending time trying to make a piece of written content easier or better. And so how does that translate into lost customers? So we know that when a customer has a poor experience with a company, for every one person who has a poor experience, they are going to generate approximately 26 other losses because of what they tell their friends, how they talk about the company, the experience that they've had with that company, and the results or the consequences. So let me give you a personal example. I had rented a car from one of the major car rental companies at the Cincinnati airport. When I tried to return it, it took me 20 minutes to find their return lot. They had a giant sign that says return rental cars, but that did not include the enterprise. In other words, it really just literally said return rental cars. So I turned into, and it took me 15 minutes before I found where I needed to return the car. And I mentioned it to the manager, and the manager said, well, when you rent the car, we always tell you to take exit 4A. Well, I had rented the car 4 days ago, and I don't know about you, but I'm lucky if I remember something for about 4 minutes, let alone 4 days. That information was not on the receipt. It was not on my email confirmation. So in addition to the frustration that I was having there, I would say I came home and did what many people do, is I told my friends about the problem. I put it on Facebook, I tweeted about it, etc. And that experience then moved over into several of my friends saying, well, I'm not going to rent from them anymore either. So, you know, we're all beginning to understand more today, I think, the ways in which poor customer experience is going to cause difficulty for our companies. On the other hand, for every good experience, your companies will often get 9 new customers. So I was on the phone with my bank. They had sent me some written information about an account. The information was confusing. I was very upset about it because I had had a problem with that bank before in terms of written content. I called the call-in, another waste of money for a company, the amount of, or the number of people who call in asking for clarification on something because it was poorly written. Anyway, I called in. The person on the phone said, I feel your frustration. I understand exactly what you're talking about. Let me help you. And within 5 minutes, he had not only solved my problem, but made me feel like he had my back. That was, to me, a delightful experience because it was quick, it was simple, he was on the same page with me. And then, of course, I suggested you might want to think about having somebody rewrite the content for that statement. And he admitted that he had gotten several phone calls about that very situation. I will also tell you that, you know, of course, as I said, happy customers influence the bottom line. Another study revealed recently that 63% of customers think that if content is difficult to understand, that it's intentionally written that way. Perhaps, again, thinking back to that agreement or some other situation that you may have found yourself in, but that 63% believe the complexity is intended, and that 84% of companies trust, 84% of customers trust those companies that use jargon-free language. So let's take a look at another piece of interesting information. This comes from Edelman's Trust Index, and the number one factor in the top 5 factors that increase trust in the financial services was easily understood terms and conditions. I also want to let you know that there's a call center for a major company that was able to reduce its costs by 20% by using plain language. A clinic revised a bill and the call-ins dropped, as well as allowing them to gain back a lost $1 million in revenue from people calling in. So what happens when we give people information that is difficult is we get unnecessarily support calls, poorly written forms and applications, ineffective memos or emails that are never answered either internally or by our customers. And for those of you, let me just say this, for those of you who are trying to make the argument for the use of plain language within your company, I can provide sources for some of the research that I'm discussing here today. Another study that was done that said that legal disclosures, when written in plain language, that comprehension goes up to 66%, that anything that we would consider to be a legal document or terms and conditions, et cetera, privacy policies, are more likely to be read, strongly preferred, less likely to cause people to make mistakes. People have fewer questions. And again, as I said, it reduces time and money. So what are the strategies? So one of the first important strategy is to plan your documents or plan your content. So the first thing we always suggest is to understand all the purposes for that content. What is your end goal? But even more to the point, what is the end goal or the end result that the customer wants from having invested his or her time reading that content? So we talk about knowing your audience. And again, that depending upon what sector you're in and what you're writing about, whether it's a product or a process, we advise always assuming that people know less rather than that they understand more. And start with what is the most important thing for the customer. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that in a couple of slides. Structure, of course, is very important as well, as I've mentioned. So here are some of the plain language writing strategies. So first, to be conversational or human. I mean, none of us like to read anything that obviously was written by someone who simply wanted to eliminate the situation, or that sounds more like it was written robotically. So the ability for your content to sound human, I've got your back, I want to give you the information that will help you, all of those are both psychologically and cognitively important when someone is reading information. I've already mentioned writing short sentences and paragraphs, using the you attitude, which means focusing on the reader or the customer, so that we use the word you to represent the customer. We use the word we to represent the company, to always recognize that a human being is going to be sitting and reading our information. We like to talk about the importance of using verbs. So information particularly that is a call to action of one kind or another, we want to focus on verbs rather than nouns. So for example, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, we must make a determination of, or we must make an evaluation of, when really what we want to do is evaluate or determine. Using the active voice, so subject, verb, object, submit this form to us, as opposed to this form should be submitted to us. Using positive language, that is phrasing things in the most positive way. And just as a minor example, rather than say, please do not hesitate to call, language like please feel free. Psychologically, the use of the word not, or focusing on telling people what they should not do, gives people the impression that even when you're conveying positive information, you're still having a negative impact. I've mentioned avoiding jargon, of course, and sometimes we don't even know what jargon is because we're so used to using it and reading it and talking about it. And then finally, be concise. Now, I will say that there are times in which using plain language means you're going to use more words, because we're not going to use jargon, and then therefore sometimes we have to explain what something is because we're not using the shorthand of the jargon. So it's not always fewer words, but the words are critical to the understanding. So let me start to give you a few more examples. So what do customers want? So a friend of mine was at the clinic recently, and the doctor that she was meeting with said this to her. Okay, well, she told me later that she burst out laughing when the doctor told her this. And then she said, "Could you please explain that to me in a way that I can understand?" So the doctor took another go at it and said this. So she laughed a little less than she did, but then finally she said, "All right, I'm going to tell you what I think you've told me, and let me know if this is correct." And this is what she said to him. And he laughed and said, "Yeah, that's exactly right." And she said, "Well, then let's start with that and not make the patient work through number one, which is doctor language, number two, which is bureaucratic language, and number three, which is how the average person would explain that information to a friend." Another example. So on the left, I paused just to give you a moment to laugh about the elongated yellow fruit. On the left, we have words that are multisyllabic, which when we went to college, we were encouraged, and in fact probably required, to use multisyllabic words to explain almost anything. The words on the right mean exactly the same thing. They're simple. They're often only one or two syllable. And again, regardless of how much education anyone has, the words on the right can be read and understood cognitively much more quickly than the words on the right than the words on the left. And I think if you keep in mind a phrase I like to use, that your customers want to get in, get it, and get out, they can do that with short, singular words with only one or two syllables. So I mentioned something about you attitude a little while ago, and if you'll notice on this example from my PayPal account, they use the word you, so that's good. They use the word we, so that's good. But if you look at that opening sentence, where is the stress? What are they stressing? They're stressing the product with PayPal. I'm the customer. What is most important to me is I want to send money to somebody, and I want to do it, frankly, with as little hassle as possible. So if we were to rewrite this PayPal before, we would start with, you can send money to anyone with an email address by using PayPal, because we're focused on the customer's problem or the customer's need, not on the product itself. And then there were a few other places where we made some changes, like on the left, there's an instance where they put more than one action in a sentence, and every action should have its own number and on its own line. And then at the bottom, they're really giving us information that is similar to what they told us that we could do, but it has more to do with what PayPal could do. So we decided to divide it up. How do you send money? And then what will we do? So it's really, here's your responsibility, here's our responsibility. And notice when I mentioned verbs before, notice that what will we do? We're going to ask, we're going to explain, we're going to send. So the verbs themselves push people forward with their action. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. A little while ago, I mentioned context. So I don't know where you live or what your traffic is like, but in Charlotte, it's almost impossible to park anywhere. And whomever originally came up with how to create parking signs had absolutely no interest in understanding the context in which we're going to have to read this information and respond to it. So here we are in a car, somebody's behind us, we have about 30 seconds to figure out whether or not on Wednesday at 3 I can actually park in this spot. And then just to show you that plain language really is important in terms of visual as well as verbal, look what this beautiful designer did to create a new kind of parking schedule. Now, talk about customer experience. The one on the left would drive me crazy and does. The one on the right was, again, delight. And here we have, so delight and empathy are very important in using plain language. That's why we talk about it being conversational, being human, using a you attitude, using positive language, etc. Because you have a higher chance of getting to delight by using plain language strategies. So I'll give you another example. So here's a situation in which someone went to a clinic and afterwards they got information from it was Covered California, their health insurance. And because they wrote in and said that they thought that the clinic itself was billing inappropriately. So they thought, well, I just think that this health insurance ought to know about what looks to me like double billing, or there was just some problem with it. And so just as you're sitting and watching and listening to this webinar, think about like, what would be the questions that you would have for the insurance company as you're about to report something that you think has gone wrong. So keeping those questions in mind, so here's the answer, part of the answer that she received. So I'm not going to torture you by asking you to even read it, but basically what happened is that they just went on and on explaining their internal process for what happens when someone experiences or someone has what they consider to be a complaint. So no empathy, no delight, and in fact, they did not answer the customer's questions, because in general, what we would want to know if we were reporting something like that is, what are you going to do about it, and will you let me know? So a response with empathy and or delight would first determine what are the questions that my customer is going to have about this information, and then answer those questions, because I think none of us are particularly interested in the internal processes of a health insurance company. Another situation, I was looking at some wonderful pieces of advice, and I've given you a link at the bottom, 23 ways to delight or amaze your customers. And if you'll notice how many of them have to do with communication. Respond quickly, make your customers feel valued. And of course, this is for written communication as well. If you screw up, apologize. Be consistent, so the same words for the same information. Empathize, empower. So all of it is about sincere, useful communication. And then I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a case study that occurred that I was part of several years ago. again with TIAA, and I always thank them for allowing me to do this. So here's the situation. So TIAA, for those of you who don't know, their participants, as they're called, or their customers, are primarily professors, doctors, scientists, etc. So they tend to be the repository for investments, particularly from academia. And so the academics tend to be people with PhDs who frankly think they know everything about everything. I can say that because I used to be one. And what happened was that they sent out a letter to all of their participants who were nearing 70 and a half. At that age, they are required to take a certain amount of, they call it a minimum distribution, but they're required to take a certain amount of money from their investments. What happened was, because of the way the original letter was written, within a week, they got 10,000 phone calls from investors who were freaking out because, first of all, the opening sentence said the IRS requires. And so some people stopped reading right there, call assuming that it had to do with taxes or that they were in trouble, etc. And so they were very confused and intimidated by the original letter, which I'm going to show you now. So if you'll notice a few things about this, so there's the IRS. Then they talk about minimum distribution option without defining what they mean by it. They give you a lot of information about the minimum distribution requirements, again, without having really defined what it actually means. Then they say if you don't do it, you could be subject to a 50% excise tax. Now, the purpose, the deep purpose of this letter was not so much to inform them, the participants, of all the rules. It was really to get them to call TIAA so that they could help the customers make some decisions. Nobody was in trouble. This was something they needed to do, but the tone of the letter was not friendly and was not basically, hey, here's something you need to do. Give us a call. We will help you figure out how to do this to your best advantage. So the revision turned into this. So we did mention the Internal Revenue Code, but we didn't say the IRS. We did say you must receive income, which was the definition of minimum distribution. Originally, they were still using the word option, so people thought they had an option to do it, but of course they did not. Now, what was the result of the changes that were made? Oh, just as a quick, that was the original paragraph in the middle, which was then reduced to just this table. So what was the result? So two things happened, one of which was really a surprise. The first one was that the positive calls went to 95%. And in combination with the letter that people received that sounded like, hey, here's something we need to talk to you about. We've got your back. Give us a call. Let's help you figure it out. Which then generated 95% positive call-ins as opposed to the 10,000 calls they had gotten in 1 week where the participants were really upset and frustrated and confused. In addition, and I laugh about this because they would never tell me how much, those participants receiving those letters brought millions of new dollars into the company because they felt, one, that the letter was very helpful and encouraged them to call without confusing them with information they didn't need in the letter. And because then the experience with talking at the call center itself was very positive. And the surprise for TIAA was the investments, the new investments that came in to the company. That was really to them something they had never expected. So I want to just re-emphasize to you, and again, I know for many of you who are in marketing, a lot of these principles are those that you are aware of, but the use of plain language decreases wasted time, increases customer trust, can increase profits. We didn't really talk about regulatory requirements, but they meet regulatory requirements for anything that has to be clear and conspicuous. It makes your customers happy, and frankly, even inside your company, it makes your employees more productive. So if you're looking for a delightful customer experience, I would say that clarity and plain language is one of the most significant ways to do that. Thank you very much. And before I turn this over to May, I want to tell you that for those of you who are interested, I will be sending you a list of resources that you might find useful, or you may contact me at deborah@theplainlanguagegroup.com, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have or share a list of resources. Okay, my time is up. I'm going to turn this back over to May, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Deborah. That was amazing. Before going into Q&A, I've got so many questions of my own. Just a quick note on who Qordoba is. We're software that makes it very easy to align writers in an organization so that all writers can write with the same terminology, style, and brand voice. The product has plain language guidelines built in. This is why we really wanted to dig deep with Deborah on the business impacts of employing plain language guidelines in your business. What that means is with our guidelines, anything you write and where you write can be checked against plain language rules, like the ones that Deb mentioned: conversational, use short sentences, using the active voice, avoiding jargon. Our broader style guides product allows for pretty granular control over what your writers can and cannot do, and the checking can happen either in Qordoba or across the web via a browser extension. We've been lucky enough to work with some of the smartest content teams in the world, some of whom are Deb's clients too, helping them create better, more impactful content that is clear and easy to read. Now, time for some Q&A. You guys can write in at the bottom of your screens. We already have some questions in. I'd love to kick off, Deborah, with a couple of questions of my own that have come up while listening to you. And I do think, given some of where the conversation is, folks are eager to know these answers as well. And the first one is, clearly plain language has a massive economic impact when it's used, both in cost savings and in expanded brand value with customers and everything that can do. Can you talk a little bit about how folks can make the case internally that utilizing and rolling out plain language guidelines against all content that organizations produce can be impactful to the bottom line? What do you see your customers and clients doing internally, and how can some of our audience today use what you've talked about to make the economic case for plain language?
Well, I would say there are a few ways that we can do this. I mean, the first way I would say is if there is regulations around information that is coming from your company, you know, there's nothing like the force of regulation to move people forward. But secondly, and probably more to your point, is one client of mine started collecting data from the call-in center, and they had found that no one had collected information on how often people called in as a result of having received information that they did not understand. And so by gathering that data, they were able to show their director not only the emotional impact or the, you know, from the call-ins, but also the wasted time that was spent, and the fact that the customer experience with written content caused him or her to call in and be frustrated. so I think those two things, I think if there is a situation in which confusion has cost the company money, of course, that can be helpful to use. As I said, I'm happy to provide resources, but I will say truthfully, it can come from someone at a mid-level emphasis by presenting some of the data that I've given to you, but this usually becomes a top-down initiative. In other words, if you can get one director, or depending on the hierarchy of your company, one person in a high position to recognize some of the research or some of the numbers, then you have a chance of getting this to work within your company. So I think you kind of have to work your way up so that they can then work their way down throughout. But research, I think, is a fundamental way to explain. So I think data and some of the research that I presented for you today.
Cool, that's very helpful. I found the example, just shifting gears a little bit, I found the privacy policy example so good. And, you know, given how much user and kind of public outrage there is at how tech companies are monetizing some of our data, can you tell a little bit, can you share a little bit of what you're seeing in the industry on how tech companies are using or thinking of using plain language to rewrite user agreements and the terms and conditions that come with our using so many of these free consumer products? How are folks addressing that?
Well, let me say this, that probably the most significant push in that direction has come as a result of what's called GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation that comes out of the EU. It requires seriously and formidably that any of the documents that you mentioned, privacy policies, terms and conditions, be written in plain language so that any company that does business in the EU is required by them to create clear privacy policies, etc. So I think this is why all of us have probably been inundated lately, at least I have, so I'm sure others too, with email from this company, that company, and the other company saying, hey, we've rewritten our privacy policies, or hey, we have a new version of our terms and conditions. Because as I said earlier, the most formidable push comes at the expense, not at the expense, comes as a result of a regulatory push. Yeah. And we are in a very odd situation where terms and conditions where we have to click, I have read and understood and I agree, which in my field we laugh and say is like the biggest lie in America. We all do that because if we don't agree, we cannot get access. And there was a company that embedded in one of its terms and conditions that if you agree, you are giving up your firstborn child. And of course, only to prove the point that no one reads them. But the push to make them clear is going to increase the likelihood that they will now actually be read by customers, so that at least we're informed with what it is we're sharing or not sharing.
Yeah, really.
And I mean, and truthfully, I think that we as customers and citizens, I think we have a right to understand information that affects our lives. So to be informed about your product or about your company means I have to understand what you're communicating to me about your company or your product.
Yeah, really helpful, Deb. Thank you. Lots of questions from the audience. I want to start with one around boilerplate. And we addressed this internally very recently. What are your tips on helping folks write boilerplate that doesn't sound stale and stiff?
Well, I think I like to think of that as what's the conversation that you're trying to have? So how would you explain that information if you and I were sitting down having a cup of coffee and you needed to tell me whatever the information on the boilerplate was? Just because it's the same information that goes to a multitude of people, maybe with Dear Deborah or Dear May, it still can sound helpful, human. We've got your back. Here's something we think you might want to know. Here's something you might be interested in. And so boilerplate doesn't automatically presume dull and boring. It can be lively and it can be informative, even if it's a boilerplate. At least that's how I think of it.
Yeah, I like that. Once we found ourselves using the terminology internally of this is our official who we are and this is our conversational who we are, we knew we had a problem. They absolutely should just be one and the same.
Correct, absolutely. Particularly in this day and age with, you know, where everybody wants millennials to be their customers. I think, you know, it'll be even more off-putting to not be conversational.
Yeah, absolutely. A interesting question that I'm curious about too, because I've never heard of this term. What do you think of the theory of disfluency? That adding a little friction to readability can aid in deeper understanding by the reader by actually giving them some hoops to go through?
I think if you're writing literature, that makes sense to me, because I mean, there is evidence that if people have to spend more time, they will have a better understanding. But I don't think that that is true for the kind of writing that at least that I work with and most of us do, which is transactional. I think we need to catch someone's attention. We need to keep their attention, but we can keep it with the tone and the language that we're using rather than by complexity. At least that's my attitude about it. I don't really think the results will be what one might think they could be. But I do have to also admit that's not an area that I know a lot about. It just logically to me makes little sense when it comes to, I need to do this, show me or tell me how to do it, and let's get it in and out quickly.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I'm going to ask a couple more questions as quickly as possible. They're all so interesting, and I know we only have a couple minutes left. We've got a number of folks in the audience from tech companies and in the product world, and some of that copy that they write needs to be reviewed by legal. So in your experience,
Correct.
What's the best way to work with lawyers when wanting to implement plain language across a user experience? And folks tend to find that they're usually resistant to language changes because of the legal context, but what has been your experience?
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, if I could get rid of the lawyers, we could just go ahead and make everything plain language. But I do understand what their job is to mitigate risk. So there are a couple of things. First, you really need an ally. And you might be surprised that there are many attorneys that are really on board with the whole concept of plain language and recognize that information can be both legal and understandable. So if you can find even one ally among the people either in legal or even in compliance can help you in that, in terms of advocating for plain language. So I would say first look for an advocate among the attorneys. If there are none, then look to regulatory requirements, because regulations will say what information must be included, but it does not usually say how you must say something. And you also might recommend a book by Brian Garner, I believe it's called Legal Language, but he and Antonin Scalia wrote a book about the importance of plain language in the law. So I think if you can cite information to show attorneys that there are positive consequences, not just negative ones.
Fantastic, that's super helpful. One last one, if we can squeeze it in a minute here. It's from somebody who works on technical documentation. What's your view, Deb, on applying plain language when it comes to technical documentation where integration instructions and other kind of technical topics of that nature require more jargon and specific types of words?
Well, as someone who taught technical communication for 20 years, I can speak to this because my students were often graduate engineers, graduate students in engineering, computer science. So so a lot of the principles would still apply. You can still list information. If you're writing instructions, you can still give only one action per step. You can still use headings. You can still avoid lengthy paragraphs. So even if the information itself is highly technical and you are sure that your readers understand the technical language, some of the other principles would still apply. So I think that even if all you did was carefully look at the formatting and how quickly someone could read through and understand the formatting as a vehicle to help with the technical information, then I think that would be a big step in and of itself.
Cool. Wonderful. Great answer. Great hour spent with you, Deb. Really hope you'll come back and talk to us more. I think this is a really rich area for content strategists and folks trying to make a dent in their content operations across companies of lots of different verticals. So thank you very much.
And thank you. And thanks to the audience today. Thank you, everyone.